Good evening, and thank you all for being here. Nate, congratulations. Thank you, Nate and Jean, for just a really beautiful evening last night, one that was really warm and welcoming, and one that left Dawn and I feeling so welcome in the community. Rico, thank you for your comments. Many have asked those same questions. So we're going to begin tonight with embracing chance. It's something I think about a lot. Do we over-architecture? Do we over-engineer our buildings? The process of making, of creating, of shaping. This began as I began to collect Japanese art some 15 years ago and fell in love with the process of making that the Japanese embrace as they create. But it was also, our practice is also informed by these pristine environments. And so 15 years ago as a firm, we invested in a 570-acre piece of land in Patagonia, Chile. I had become close friends with Doug and Chris Tompkins. If you don't know the story, Doug started North Face in Esprit, and Chris was the CEO of Patagonia with Yvon Chouinard. They, 20-something years ago, moved down to Patagonia, and over the course of 20-something years, purchased 2.5 million acres, leveraged it into 25 million acres and 17 national parks, and are just a very inspiring couple. And so I asked Doug if he would sell me personally and the firm an exquisite piece of pristine landscape. And so we purchased this 570-acre piece, which is the peninsula. It's surrounded by the Corcovado National Park and the Corcovado Tiktok Marine Park. So it's an island, so to speak. In March of every year, the orcas come into the bay here, and you begin to get a sense of scale. And so the question we've asked in purchasing this real estate is how significant, how important it is to intervene in any landscape, whether rural or urban. And we began to challenge ourselves with the importance of this decision, because I must admit, so many times I took this decision so lightly. It just seemed part of the practice. And so we make 2 or 3 trips a year, occasionally take down members of the staff. We enjoy the dynamic nature of such a powerful place with the black volcanic beaches and the Andes Mountains. The closest human intervention is Raul Marin Balmaceda, which is an hour and a half by boat ride. We must fly in or boat in all the food and provisions. But it's been amazing over the 15 years to experience the shifts and the changes, not because of climate change, but just because of the ecosystem here, and begin to develop a sense of how powerful and unique this ecosystem is. There are trees in the Corcovado National Park that are referred to as alerci. They're 2,000 years old, and they're of massive scale, of course, but their impact is significant as we deal with all the climate issues. Life at all scales is very precious here and has impacted the way the firm practices architecture, the way we think about space, the way we think of our responsibility to the planet, and to the way we think about serving as humanitarians first and architects second. Over 15 years, we've managed to build just one thing. There are 2 small cottages that Doug Tompkins built, and that's a pier. And most of the pier was constructed out of coiway trees, which are these massive, large fallen trees on the property. And so here it is. It's approximately 300 feet long. Each of these members is 2 feet wide, 12 feet long, 6 inches thick. And something that was very meaningful to me is that we blind wood pegged this pier. And so there's absolutely no foreign material that was brought in to construct this piece. And so it feels so appropriate to this massive landscape. And so it began to set a bar for us of of hopefully making the most responsible decisions in building rootedness, part of our ethos. How do we, with tremendous integrity, anchor, respond to place, and not fall victim to software and other things that at the time feel interesting or sexy or of its time? And so our search has been about rootedness, and I think it's important to speak to. I am very much aware that I reside in a place where in some communities of Louisiana there are 12 feet of topsoil, and that we are at the end of this massive watershed, and that power and that distribution of annual silt and that annual flooding is very much a part of our history, our culture, our agrarian life, the way we think and the way we see each other. As mentioned, I fell in love with Japanese art some 20 years ago. I purchased a book on raku art at the MoMA Museum in New York, and I found that these beautiful, simple tea bowls were extremely powerful and at times rare. It was in 1570 that Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the warlord that was attempting to unify Japan, fell in love with tea. He identified Shinnu Rikyu as the master of tea and said to Rikyu, please identify a ceramicist, an artist that can create a tea bowl, an avant-garde tea bowl that can challenge the Chinese and the Koreans. Chojuro made 23 tea bowls. They have never been allowed to leave Japan. Over the past 15 years, I've built a wonderful relationship with the Raku family, and 6 months ago took ownership of this piece, which was made in 1580. It touches me deeply. You can see the pooling of tea over the hundreds of years. But what you feel when you hold it is the power of chance. And it's what I question about architecture. Should we embrace chance? Should we build chance into the process? How do we deal with the legal issues associated with chance? The Japanese speak often of shaping the tea bowl, the clay, and gifting it to the kiln. And the kiln expressing itself or adding a voice to the process of making and taking it to a far more beautiful place. So this is where we start with our work. How do we create spaces that are deeply quiet, at times still, of place, but have some chance embedded in the process of creating space? This is the Magazine Street Museum, a project at 309 Magazine Street in New Orleans in the CBD. And it's also about my love and passion for Richard Serre's work. So here we begin to clad the existing historic void, which is a site 24 feet wide by 200 feet long, with these massive 17-foot wide panels that are 61 feet tall, 2 inches thick. Dillinger will fabricate them in Germany. They're of such a size and mass that even at 2 inches thick, they begin to warp and twist. And so they'll be trucked down the street to a place that will flatten the steel plates, resulting in a piece of sculpture that's 200 feet long and 61 feet tall. Adjusted to this steel sculptural piece is the concrete box, a cast-in-place box that is 150 feet long by 18 feet deep, with a small 3-foot gap in between it and the steel wall. 2 floors, the first floor 15 feet, the second floor 30-foot ceiling height. And in the section to the right, you see the 2 sections. The steel wall is on the left. But it's about quiet and stillness, like the Japanese tea bowl. And so it's a radiant, heated, and cooled structure, no ductwork. It's about all lights being externally placed on top of the concrete structure and reflecting off the steel panels. At times it's about darkness, but it's about also, as one Japanese said, in praise of shadows. How do we celebrate space and we edit out at times artificial light. So it's going to be about this art collection and about the uniqueness of this space in this urban void, in this place where 250 years ago a building burned down and left the remnants here. Here's an image on the bottom half of the steel plates. You get a sense of scale. And then, of course, the glass box with two large doors on either end that actually slide, providing the means of entrance and exit into the building. And then some of the spaces, this is the lower level, and then the upper level, and just the beauty and presence of art in the space. The building would be used for community events, lectures, talks, social events, but also in contributing to other fundraising events that are much needed in a city like New Orleans. Another artist we collect is Genta Izuzuka. Genta won the Louvet Prize a couple of years ago. Interestingly enough, Genta was deeply moved one day while walking home from a grocery store. He saw this little old lady with a bag of oranges in a net bag. And he was moved by the way these spheres move and relate to each other in this mesh. And so he purchased what he finds at times deplorable, these styrofoam balls. Placed them in a mesh, and then began to paper mache them, and then began to apply 25 to 30 layers of lacquer, sanding layers as he moves through it, revealing a previous layer, creating these stunning reflective pieces that reflect space, where you rethink space, you reinterpret space because of their reflectance. And so as we begin the commission of Loyola's Chapel in New Orleans on St. Charles, we began to think about the history of the church, the chapel, St. Ignatius, these two interpenetrating circles and spheres, how the church and religious space has evolved, St. Ignatius Chapel, that carving, and questioned, could we invert that kind of expression and those relationships of those spheres and begin to create space by making these in-house models out of cast-in-place concrete. And so we started by taking balloons, and in some filling with water, and others air, and we watched as we began to pour concrete around them, these objects began to deform and shape. And so it was that element of chance that we really found intriguing, because it's in the chance, it's in that subtle, nuanced deformation that we find there to be transcendence, to be mystery, to be something that touches us, something deep inside of us that at times is unexplainable. And so we created a series of cast-in-place concrete models and fell in love with the kind of this expression, because it felt like that kiln, that placement of something in the fire that had a high degree of unpredictability. And so we brought this into the plan. How do we create, in today's day and time, this small chapel of a little over 4,300 square feet, spaces that are about equity. They are about community. They are not elongated, assigning a privileged position to any placement, but they are about gathering. And so we brought this in, and we found that we could, in these interstitial spaces between these cylindrical spaces, that we could embed program, reconciliation chapels, the sacristy, other spaces that were equally important. And then we placed it in the bottom right image on this axial condition as you move into the chapel. And so we're in construction. We hope to have it completed later on this year. It's a really small project. This gives you a sense of the campus, some of the neighborhood, the historic cemeteries, the process of making and shaping. And it's at this point that we begin to think about maybe our process of designing should begin with the end, meaning maybe we should begin to think about who's making these things, what craftsmen are out there, and how do we converse or collaborate with them. And so these are other pieces that we collect. These are Koji Hatakeyama. Each of these artists are in a significant number of museums internationally, and Koji's about cast bronze, and he makes these beautiful boxes out of cast bronze. He enjoys the high level of unpredictability. But then you open these boxes up and there's this kind of exuberance, this surprise, this pleasant, unique space embedded in the cast bronze box. And so as we were commissioned for the Louisiana State Museum and were directed by the museum director to embrace the history of the Mississippi River pre-levee. So developing a real thorough understanding of how rivers deposit and scour, how sediments stratify, and at different elevations in water, they shape the river differently. We also embraced, though, the plantation and the plantation shutter. So we began to build models. We started with the Fisk maps, which is the map to the left, which depicts the ancient meanders of the Mississippi River over the thousands of years pre-levee, and then began to build 3D models of these, and then worked toward developing an understanding of how we could use this river morphology to connect to Natchitoches, Louisiana, the oldest settlement in Louisiana Purchase territory. And so we began to study different materials. We talked to friends in Zaha's office, and they said, whatever you do, do not use a massive material, use a thin veneer. This was many years ago. Of course, we rejected that advice, and we decided to build it out of cast stone. I think it's part of the culture of the firm, challenging the norm. But it was about river morphology. It was about how do you integrate two programs, a program about history and a program about sports. At one point, we had completed the model, we'd completed the drawings, only to find out that the fire marshal rejected it because he said we had a few spots where the sprinkler heads were not achieving coverage, so we had to begin again. We worked with a cast stone supplier out of Georgia, and we thought we were in budget. Quite frankly, as we went through that process, they assigned a value per square foot to different levels of complexity. On bid day, they realized they were the only bidders, tripled their number, and so the state of Louisiana looked at me and said, you're gonna have to redraw it. We found a cast stone supplier in Texas, not far from here, who had a dry cast stone process. We changed one line in the spec to include wet and cast stone suppliers. The project came in budget. The original sub that worked with us was high, and we enjoyed the privilege of a local supplier and built the building. But it was about, to us, bousillage, that early product in Louisiana of how we build. It's the vertical image, which is clay, horsehair, and moss. And for us, that rootedness is about how can we extract from place something that informs a way of building, of shaping, that creates spaces that maybe not obvious to the eye initially, but over time you'll begin to make connections to how the earliest settlers built. And so there were over 1,100 cast stone molds, dry cast stone packed, 1,100 different shapes. Here's some of the earliest work. You can see a nominal thickness of 5 inches of the panels. With the 3D station, they maintained a 3/8 inch joint between these panels. The exterior was influenced by a lot of the historic plantations in New Orleans and throughout Louisiana, which are the shutters, the cypress shutters, and that operability. And so we began to freeze them with these handmade, shaped, bent copper louvers that are around all sides and envelop this box. So once again, finding that cast stone box within, or shaped, sculpted space within the copper box, similar to Koji Hatakeyama's work. And then the copper is just aging and patinaing beautifully. And here you see, even embedded in this facade is the jumbo door, which is used to extract or move artwork, large artwork into the building, but you can't even see it. It's seamlessly integrated into the copper. And then a number of other images. And then, of course, the front porch in Louisiana and the relationship of the porch to the river that the building sits adjacent to. Once again, the Japanese art of weaving, Bora textiles, are now what we're referring to as Japanese rural textiles. And the shishiki stitch, and that way of weaving something together. And so for us, when we were invited as one of 29 for the Alliance Theater in Atlanta, We questioned the budget. It was a new room with 650 seats for a little over 17 million. How could we build this space for that budget? Because they wanted something that they said was very progressive. They wanted it to be a room of tremendous warmth. And so we began the process studying Richard Meyer's High Museum, Piano's Little Village. It led to a quick master plan, which then led to a comment by Susan Booth, who said, I would like the space, the room, to confront the inequities of a period in history when certain members of our society are relegated to the balcony. And so we began to think about how do we create a singular community? How do we integrate the orchestral level with the balcony level? And what does that mean? And we looked towards Mateusz Pliznik, this brilliant sculptor in Brooklyn, who creates these beautiful benches, which is the lower image to the far right. Met with Mateusz and asked if he would work closely with us. And so we began to use this process of steaming these half-inch square reclaimed white oak members, and how we could shape it, and how it would begin to integrate the orchestral level and the balcony. But more than that, how it could become performative, how the convergence of these members would create solid surfaces to deflect sound, and so they would be informed by the acoustical engineering. And when they diverged, they became the absorptive. And so we began to map these with the acoustical engineers. We used 3D laser strategies to place every strand in the room. And so the top image to the second from the right is where we're placing the ribs through the use of the laser technology. And then you can see how the artisans are beginning to place each of the members on the lower image in the space. And so it allowed us in our 3D model to place each strand that we turned over to Keller to place them in the space itself. So for us, it was achieving what we believe to be beauty, but beauty with integrity because of the performative aspect of these pieces. A few images of the completed space, and hopefully a singular family feeling one community in celebration of events that take place here. Shozo Michikawa, another Japanese artist and one we collect. Shozo takes a block of clay and just delicately with an X-Acto blade makes around an 1/8 inch to a 1/4 inch incision around the block, places it on the wheel, and then takes a large dowel, and at times almost a wooden member the size and cylinder and dimension of a bat, and begins to force it down the middle of this block of clay, creating these beautiful, sculpted, unpredictable pieces. And so as we began to work on Luther George Park in Springdale, Arkansas, we began to think of his pieces and how could we create an outdoor performance stage that was in some ways predictable, but in other ways in our shaping unpredictable. We turned to CIG in Amsterdam, and as you can see, they are responsible for making a number of Anish Kapoor's beautiful pieces, and began working with them to shape the steel plate for this outdoor performance stage. A number of the plates, or many of the plates, are actually hand-hammered. And so do they follow the model? Yes, but not precisely. And we like that unpredictability of the making of these plates. So it's in a beautiful park. It's the archway. It's part of the threshold of entering the park. But it's also about performance exterior. And so the lawn seats about 2,000 people. Here you see in the middle of the image the performance piece. And then recent images of CIG forming these plates, at times using some of our 3D models to etch on the back of the plates some of the moves. But here you begin to see these plates, something that really excites me, the size and scale of these pieces, the hand making, the hand shaping of these massive plates. And here you see at times are grinding joints to meet tolerances. But here you get a sense of scale of to me, the beauty of these steel plates. And as mentioned earlier, so our work has been about moving from the platonic solid, the box, to degrees of deformation. And I think it's something we really are challenged by and at times question. I think we're moving more and more to subtle deformation. We find it far more interesting, far more beautiful. And so we return to the Chojuro T-bowl and the way they make these T-bowls, the hand compressing, the shaping of the T-bowl. Fascinating project. A gentleman walked in the office one day and he said, I own a funeral home. And I own a funeral home that serves the Black community. And so I'm interested in conversing with this firm, entering into a conversation about what burial means in the Black community in New Orleans. And so we spent an entire year having those conversations about how the Black community celebrates life and what that means to burial. He purchased an entire city block. He asked us to develop a deep understanding of the second line and to develop papers, white papers, so to speak, on how New Orleans celebrates the neutral ground, that space that was created, which is now Canal Street, between the French Quarter and the American sector. The celebration of weddings, Mardi Gras, but most important to him, burial. And so we started by studying the different cemeteries in New Orleans and how they progressively moved to these edged structures, so to speak, and moved from this beautiful irregularity to something that is more formalized. The program is the headquarters building for the funeral home, a large chapel, a small chapel, a crematorium, a horse and buggy, and a couple of stables, and also a museum that pays tribute to burial of the Black community in New Orleans. This space was once a plantation. It was a flooded marsh with cypress trees. And so for us, it was about questioning that axial condition that set up the hierarchy or privilege of the plantation home and used it to connect the site to other assets throughout the community. And so as burial takes place throughout on this site, the second line will meander throughout this community, hopefully reinvigorating the poor St. Roch community. We've taken another year to develop a thorough understanding of how do we build rammed earth in New Orleans, a climate with 60 inches of rain. And we finally figured it out. We just produced the 5 successful cylinders. They ranged in compressive strength from 2,700 to 5,000. The mix is 5% cement, it's 65% sand, and another 30% of silt. And so we will construct these series of buildings with rammed earth, a unique technique of building in New Orleans, but we're also returning to those buildings that are about quiet and stillness, about celebrating life in a way that is devoid of certain decorative elements that in the firm we find to be distractions. And so for us, the beauty is in the materiality of these walls. A few years back, we formed Designing for Democracy, a 501c3. And so Designing for Democracy does most of our research work, which has gotten really extensive and expansive, quite frankly. But it's that which I hope is informing a more authentic response. The sustainability principles, we're working with SCAPE, that has a New Orleans office, about a number of different strategies here, which we think will be effective and contribute significantly. Rooftop gardens, a number of outdoor performance spaces, slits, but the beauty of the rammed earth and the structures. Most of the material, all of the material, has been retrieved within a 15 to 20 mile radius of the site, and then a number of images that give you a sense of the process of retrieving these materials and rethinking rammed earth as a part of sand, silt, and clay. And so here we are with the placement of some of the aggregates and the cylinders, and the most recent cylinders that the four to the right passed the compressive test. So Osaka, this was a really interesting project. We're part of Brick and Wonder in New York, and we received a call one day asking if we were interested in interviewing for the Osaka Pavilion representing the U.S. We were told they would call that day around noon for the interview. They didn't call, and so I was home that evening when Richard Mulhern called, and it served to benefit us because I didn't care to talk about architecture that evening. And so as the conversation developed, all I talked about was Japanese art and the beauty of chance and the beauty of their pieces. And at the end, Richard said, for the first time I've interviewed an architect, and he's never talked about a building, not one of his buildings, and not about building, but about shaping and making other things, other artifacts that touches in meaningful ways. Admittedly, I talked about the T-bowl and spoke of its beauty in being a rare art form that touches the lips and nourishes us. So we were selected 2 weeks later, developed a sketch, but began to think about who we are and where we come from. And what does that mean in Louisiana? All these axial conditions, these plantations that tee up the privileged position of the plantation house. And what that meant to rethinking an invitation to the world. And so to the right is the image of the building that we will start construction on in about 60 days in Osaka. It's the U.S., as you would expect, is enjoying a privileged position as it relates to the east entrance and the Forest of Tranquility. So the two black wedge pieces with the suspended cube is the design that the State Department and Ambassador Rahm Emanuel has approved. It's the convergence of these two planes, so the invitation is to the whole community. But as you move inward underneath the cube, you're reminded that you're one, and you're held accountable for your personal contributions to society. It's about these LED screens on both walls that would depict the images of the U.S. from urban canyons to the natural canyons, to this floating cube that will house some of NASA's most interesting discoveries and technology. It was a very unique commission for us because we're about materiality and permanence, and this is about a $50 million investment that will be dismantled in 6 months. What was really exciting to us from a sustainability perspective was that ESG, who we brought in, had constructed a number of venues in Tokyo at the Olympics, and were able to provide us with dismantled kit parts for the structural systems that we would reuse for this. Now, most, if not all of the projects I presented earlier are really hard to make money on, right? In fact, you have to be asking, how are they not bankrupt? And I think it's because our business strategy is every few years to identify a rather large commission. We were selected for the Superdome, a $250 million project after Katrina. It's a 2 million square foot building with a 9.8 acre roof. You're familiar with the images of Katrina and the impact. It was quite a fascinating project, but allowed us to develop a deep understanding of the importance of this building in this community. It really is the living room for New Orleans. And so the project after Katrina was about reskinning the building, a new aluminum skin. But this project, a $450 to $500 million project, is about rethinking the circulation strategy. The top middle image is of the red depicts these massive ramps that we have removed, and they provided over 100,000 square feet of space that is now serving as support space for general seating, club seats, and suites. And with that, we began to sculpt and carve in the corners these massive atriums that go from the bottom of the gutter tub to the ground level. And here you see these massive spaces that at times have these moments peering into the volume of the Superdome, a building that will be 50 years old next year as we celebrate, as Nate mentioned, the Super Bowl, a building that's on the Historic National Register. And so it's these types of projects that eats up an enormous amount of our staff, but provides us with a financial security that allows other members and teams in the office to pursue the work I presented earlier. Thank you.